The first light of dawn had not yet crept over the distant pines, yet the entire rosewater plantation seemed to quiver under the weight of something unspoken. The fields lay still, unnaturally still, as if the earth itself refused to stir. Even the crows, usually loud and unapologetic at this hour, clung silently to the branches above, feathers puffed against the cold morning air. Inside the big house, Master Aldrich Thorne made his way down the hallway with the heavy stride of a man drunk on authority. The long whip he carried rested against his shoulder like a trusted companion, polished so often its leather gleamed even in dim light. Today, 5 slaves would feel its bite, not for crimes, not for sabotage, but because Aldrich believed the smallest hesitation from a man was reason enough to teach him obedience. He saw defiance everywhere, in a glance too steady, a voice too slow, a posture too straight, and so he prepared to purge it. Outside, near the whipping post, the chosen 5 waited with breaths that trembled despite their composed faces. Elias stood tallest among them, his back a web of raised scars that never fully healed. His strength had made him a target for years, and Aldrich resented any strength he didn't own. Next to him stood Jonas, smaller but sharp-eyed, always calculating in silence. Miriam, the only woman among them, held her chin high, though fear coiled inside her chest like a tightening rope. Samuel and Tobias, brothers inseparable since childhood, exchanged one brief look, an entire conversation compressed into a heartbeat. They all knew what was coming, and they all understood this morning would become another memory carved into their bodies. Aldrich stepped onto the porch, each footstep echoing across the yard like a warning. He lifted the whip and snapped it once through the air, relishing the sound. "Line up," he barked, not bothering to look the 5 in the eye. They obeyed, stepping forward with rigid shoulders and hearts thrumming beneath their ribs. Elias braced himself, jaw locked, eyes steady. The first lash cracked through the morning quiet like lightning. Pain ignited across his back, tearing into old scars, but he remained still. He wouldn't give Aldrich the satisfaction of a cry, not anymore. Each strike he endured was counted silently, each number becoming another stone in a growing foundation of resolve. Jonas came next. His body jerked as the whip found its mark again and again, crimson blooming across his skin. But behind his calm, Aldrich never noticed the spark, small but unwavering, burning deeper than any lash could reach. Miriam's turn brought a raw, desperate scream from her throat, but even in agony, her eyes stayed bright with a promise that would not die. Samuel and Tobias took their punishment in rigid silence, their breaths sharp, fists clenched behind their backs. Aldrich believed their silence was obedience, but he misread the truth entirely. They were not breaking. They were storing every second of pain, every insult, every drop of blood, and they were waiting. As the hours stretched on, Aldrich grew careless. He tossed the used whips aside without checking the coils. He didn't see the small chips of stone the 5 had hidden earlier beneath the dirt, or the strands of rope tucked beneath the whipping post, or the subtle way the brothers shifted their feet to bury something further into the soil. Pain had taught them patience, survival had taught them precision, and cruelty, Aldrich's vicious, relentless cruelty, had taught them how to adapt. By the time the sun crept toward its highest point, Aldrich declared himself satisfied. Sweat glistened along his temples as he wiped the whip clean, humming a tune that made the 5 sick to hear. He dismissed them with a flick of his fingers, thinking he had tamed them once again. He did not recognize the slow, simmering unity forming between them as they walked back toward the quarters. Their bodies burned, skin torn and stinging, yet their steps did not falter. They had endured worse. They had outlasted every attempt to crush them. Now, in their shared suffering, something ancient awakened. A bond sharper than iron, steadier than faith. When the others in the quarters finally saw them, the entire room fell into a hush. No questions, no words, only grim acknowledgement. Elias leaned against the wall, breathing shallowly. Jonas quietly pulled a small wooden peg from inside his sleeve, a tool carved from the broken handle of a hoe, sharpened to slip into metal locks. Miriam knelt beside her cot, lifting the loose board beneath it where they had hidden stolen scraps, rope strands, metal hooks once used for lanterns, and the 5 whips Aldrich had handled that morning. She had gathered them while feigning weakness, letting her shaking hands disguise the quick flick of her fingers. Samuel and Tobias crouched beside her, each of them touching the leather coils as if marking the moment. These were no longer tools of torment. They were beginning to look like weapons. Elias lifted one whip and ran his thumb across the blood-stiffened leather. "He carries 5, he whispered. "He will fall by 5. No one argued. No one questioned. The room's breath synchronized into a single rhythm. They were slaves by circumstance, but not by spirit. And tonight, when darkness claimed the fields, they would begin something none of them had dared imagine until now. Their pain had been a sentence, but now it was becoming a plan. Night crept slowly over the plantation, stretching long shadows across the cracked earth, as though darkness itself was reaching out to swallow the day's cruelty. Inside the slave quarters, the air was thick, heavy with pain, fear, and the electricity of something awakening among them. Elias stood at the small window, watching the yard vanish beneath the encroaching dusk. His back throbbed with every breath, but his eyes stayed sharp, burning with a steady purpose. Behind him, Jonas examined the wooden peg he'd carved, turning it between his fingers like a surgeon studying a delicate tool. It wasn't much, just a splinter of wood shaped to slip into locks, but it was enough. Tobias and Samuel sat shoulder to shoulder on the floor, laying out the coils of rope strand by strand. Their hands trembled not from weakness, but from anticipation. Miriam, her movements slow and stiff, spread the 5 whips across the cot. The leather gleamed faintly, stained with their blood. She touched each one gently, reverently, as if saying goodbye to something old and welcoming something new. The silence held for a long moment, each of them aware that the next hours would shape the rest of their lives or end them. Elias finally turned from the window. "Tonight," he said, voice low but unshakable, "we move." Jonas nodded once, pressing the peg into his sleeve. "He sleeps heavy when he drinks." Miriam exhaled shakily. "He drank enough today for a whole army." Tobias cracked his knuckles. "Then he won't hear us coming." They gathered around the whips. Elias lifted one and looped it over his shoulder. "Each one goes back to him," he murmured, "not as he meant, but as it should be." The 5 slipped out of the quarters one by one, blending into the shadows like smoke dissolving into night. The moon had dipped low behind the clouds, offering them cover. Grass brushed their feet, cool and damp, as they moved across the yard in silence. The dogs were chained near the back of the fields, old animals now too worn to patrol without stumbling. Another oversight Aldrich believed he was too powerful to correct. Fog drifted over the yard, thin and pale. It curled around their legs like a guiding spirit urging them onward. Jonas paused near the shed, listening. No guards, no footsteps, only the low hum of cicadas, their rhythms strangely subdued tonight. He motioned the others forward. They reached the barn doors, and Elias pressed his palm against the wood, pushing them gently open. The interior was dim, lit only by the faint moonlight spilling through cracks in the wall. Horses shifted restlessly in their stalls, as if sensing the tension in the air. Samuel and Tobias climbed the ladder up to the rafters, while Jonas and Miriam began securing the ropes. Each whip was tied to a beam with precise knots, loops anchored, lines taut, every placement deliberate. The barn transformed slowly, methodically, into a trap woven from leather, rope, and vengeance. Elias tugged on the first knot, testing its strength. The whip groaned, but did not give. Good. Jonas secured the 3rd rope near the stable door. Miriam checked the tension near the loft ladder, running her fingers down the leather coil as if feeling for hidden weakness. It held. One by one, they created a web that waited for Aldrich's steps, each knot a promise, each coil a reckoning. When they finished, the barn looked almost unchanged at a glance. Only someone who walked beneath the rafters, only someone who didn't see the danger he himself had created, would trigger the trap. They gathered near the barn entrance, breaths shallow but disciplined. "He won't come on his own," Tobias whispered. "He will," Miriam countered, "if he hears trouble." Jonas nodded, understanding before she finished. A scream. Elias hesitated. Someone would need to sound convincing enough to draw Aldrich from the comfort of his house. Miriam stepped forward before the men could argue. "He expects weakness from me," she said. He'll believe it's me again. He always does. Samuel shook his head. You took the worst of it today. Miriam met his gaze, eyes steady despite the pain etched across her skin. That's why he'll come running. Her logic was hard and flawless. Aldrich Thorne loved the sound of suffering, especially from those he believed were breaking. Jonas swallowed. Just don't make it real. Miriam gave a thin, humorless smile. I won't give him anything real ever again. They returned to the quarters, preparing the final piece. Elias lifted a stone the size of his fist and held it near the doorframe. Jonas coached Miriam through the sound, a cry sharp enough to split night. The kind he thinks he earned, Jonas murmured. Miriam inhaled deeply, then nodded. Elias braced himself at the door. Jonas whispered, now. The stone struck the frame with a deafening crack. Miriam screamed, raw, fierce, echoing like lightning tearing across the sky, a perfect imitation of panic. The sound raced across the plantation, slipping beneath doors, sliding through windows, tearing into Aldrich's drunken dreams. Inside the mansion, the master jolted upright, rage igniting instantly. He snatched his lantern, grabbed his favorite whip, and stormed outside with boots pounding like thunder. He didn't see the shadows watching from behind the shed. He didn't notice the barn doors slightly ajar. He didn't sense the trap waiting for him. He moved exactly where they needed him, driven by arrogance, by anger, by the certainty that fear always brought people to their knees. But fear had rotted long ago, and tonight something far stronger guided the five waiting in the dark. Aldrich's boots hammered across the yard, each stride fueled by fury rather than concern. The lantern flame wobbled wildly, casting warped shapes that leapt across the ground as he stalked toward the slave quarters. Miriam's scream still echoed in his ears, satisfying something twisted inside him. Can't leave them alone a single night, he muttered, breath hot with whiskey. But as he neared the row of cabins and saw no one outside, his gaze snapped toward the barn. One of the doors was slightly ajar, swaying just enough to catch his eye. He stopped, nostrils flaring. Another faint sound drifted from inside, a muffled whimper, a low shuffle. His temper flared hotter. Trying to hide now, he growled. I'll drag you out myself. He changed course without hesitation. The five, hidden in the deeper shadow behind the tool shed, watched him adjust his path exactly as they had hoped. Jonas counted Aldrich's steps without realizing it, lips moving silently. Tobias felt his heart slam against his ribs, his fingers flexing around the length of rope hidden at his side. Miriam's nails dug into her palms, but she kept her breathing slow. Elias watched the way Aldrich moved, the slight sway in his stride, the loose grip on the lantern. Their master was angry, yes, but he was also half-drunk and fully confident. That was what would bring him down. Aldrich kicked the barn door wider with the heel of his boot, the hinges groaning in protest. Whoever's in here, he shouted, voice booming against the rafters, you just earned yourself another round. The barn swallowed his voice, the sound fading into the rafters where Tobias and Samuel lay pressed against thick beams, bodies steady despite the tremors running through their muscles. Aldrich stepped inside, lantern held aloft, light spilled across hay bales, empty stalls and hanging harnesses. Nothing seemed out of place. The horses shifted restlessly, ears flicking at the intrusion. Aldrich squinted. Come out, he snarled. I know you're here. He took another step forward. Elias slipped in through the half-open door behind him, silent as a shadow. Jonas followed, staying close to the wall. Miriam remained outside, just beyond the threshold, keeping watch on the yard. Aldrich moved toward the center of the barn, his boots crunching faintly over stray kernels of feed. The lantern's glow rose higher as he lifted it, unknowingly illuminating the ropes and whips stretched overhead. To him, the leather coils were just part of the familiar clutter of his domain. To the five watching, those lines of shadow were sharpened fangs poised above their prey. Jonas caught Tobias's eye in the rafters and gave a tiny nod. It was time. Samuel shifted his weight, hands tightening on the rope ends. Aldrich paused, nostrils flaring again. You think I can't smell fear? He spat into the shadows. You think I ain't? His words died as something brushed lightly against his shoulder. His gaze snapped upward. He saw, for the first time, the whips looped above him, their ends tied in ways he had never instructed. Confusion creased his brow. "What in—" Elias stepped forward then, letting his presence be known. "Evening, master," he said quietly. Aldrich spun, shock flashing briefly before fury took its place. "You!" he hissed. "So it was you screaming?" Elias's mouth curved in a humorless half-smile. "Not this time." The exchange lasted only heartbeats, but in those heartbeats the balance of the world seemed to tilt. Aldrich raised his whip, ready to lash out without another word. He'd done it 1,000 times before, but before his arm could swing, Jonas jerked the first rope from the shadows above. The coil snapped tight. One of the hanging whips dropped like a snake and looped around Aldrich's throat. He staggered back, eyes bulging in shock. "What?" he choked, clutching at the leather. Samuel yanked his line next, then Tobias. The remaining whips slid down from the rafters, wrapping around Aldrich's shoulders, chest, arms, each line drawn taut by hands that once trembled under his strikes. Aldrich thrashed, dropping the lantern. It rolled across the floor, flames sputtering but not yet catching the straw. Elias lunged forward and kicked it aside, sending it spinning harmlessly into a patch of bare earth. No fire, no accident. This would not be something blamed on misfortune or chance. This would be deliberate. Aldrich fought, but every movement tightened the web around him. The more he pulled, the less air reached his lungs. "You ungrateful," he rasped, words shredding as Jonas walked closer. There was no wild rage on the younger man's face, only a calm so cold it almost seemed gentle. "We gave you everything you asked for," Jonas said softly. "Our backs, our hands, our years." Miriam stepped into the doorway then, lantern light from the house behind her, outlining her figure in pale gold. "You mistook our silence for surrender," she added. Aldrich glared at them, trying to stand taller, to salvage the illusion of power. But his knees buckled as Tobias and Samuel pulled the lines harder, forcing him down. Elias watched him sink, shoulders lowering in something like exhaustion, something like relief. "You bound us," Elias said quietly, voice steady despite the crackle of emotion beneath. "Tonight, we bind you back." Outside, the night held its breath. Inside the barn, the tools of punishment had finally turned on their master. And for the first time since Rosewater was built, the ground beneath it no longer felt like it fully belonged to him. Aldrich's knees struck the dirt with a dull thud, the sound swallowed quickly by the barn's thick air. The ropes held him upright only because the men kept their grip tight. Without them, he would have collapsed entirely. His breaths came in ragged bursts, each one rasping against the leather cinched around his throat. His eyes darted wildly around the barn, searching for a weapon, an escape, a miracle. None came. Elias stood directly before him, shoulders squared despite the trembling ache in his back. Behind him, Jonas, Tobias, and Samuel kept their lines taut, jaws set with a grimness Aldrich had never seen on their faces before. He had seen pain, compliance, exhaustion, but never this. Never purpose. Miriam stepped into the barn fully now, closing the door behind her with a soft click. The sound felt final, like a seal placed on something long overdue. Aldrich tried to speak, his voice little more than a hoarse scrape. You think this changes anything?" Elias knelt slightly, bringing his face level with the master's. "Everything changes tonight." Aldrich spat weakly at Elias's boots, the gesture more defiant than effective. "I made you," he rasped. "I kept you alive." Jonas moved closer, expression unreadable. "You kept us breathing," he said softly. "That ain't the same as living." Samuel shifted his weight, tightening the rope unconsciously. The leather cut deeper into Aldrich's throat, pulling a strangled cough from him. The master's hands clawed uselessly at the coils. For years, those hands had dictated who ate, who starved, who worked, who bled. Tonight they trembled, not in command, but in desperation. Tobias stepped beside Elias, voice low. "Look at him. He ain't the monster he thinks he is. Just a man. Just flesh." Miriam crossed her arms. "Flesh remembers," she murmured. "Scars don't lie." Aldrich shook his head violently, rage returning with a vicious strength. "I own you," he snarled, or tried to. The words cracked, breaking under the pressure around his neck. Elias straightened, his expression hardening. "A man can claim ownership of bodies," he said, "but never souls." Tobias pulled the rope again, forcing Aldrich to tilt backward, exposing his throat. Aldrich gasped, red-faced, fighting for balance. The master had always believed fear could control any spirit, bend it until it snapped. But tonight, fear had shifted sides. Jonas watched Aldrich's chest heave, watched the realization begin to dawn in his eyes, the understanding that for once he could not command the outcome. "You think you're untouchable," Jonas said quietly. "You walk like the ground owes you its obedience." Aldrich's fingers scraped the dirt, trying to dig in for leverage. "You'll hang for this," he croaked. Miriam's expression tightened. "We already been hanging," she said. "Just took you years to notice." Aldrich's gaze jumped from one face to another, searching for hesitation, weakness, pity. He found none. The barn felt smaller now, its walls closing around him, compressing the air. The horses shifted uneasily, their hooves scraping the floor as if they too sensed the shift in power. Aldrich struggled again, trying to rise, but the ropes jerked him back down. "Stop!" he demanded, voice quivering between command and plea. Elias didn't move. "You always said a man learns when he feels consequences." Jonas stepped closer still. "So feel this." Aldrich's breathing turned harsh, uneven. Sweat beaded along his temples. He had inflicted terror for years without consequence, believing himself beyond reach. But now, every heartbeat carried a truth he had never imagined. His life was no longer his own to dictate. Elias gave the slightest nod. The signal was almost imperceptible, but the others saw it clearly. Tobias shifted his grip, pulling his line tighter. Samuel mirrored him. The leather coils constricted slowly, deliberately, forcing Aldrich upright, then backward, then against the wooden post behind him. His back slammed into it, a choked cry escaping his lips. Jonas stepped to his side, winding the rope once more to keep him pinned. Miriam approached with a slow, measured step. She was shaking, not from fear, but from decades of stored anguish finally breaking open. Aldrich's eyes widened as she neared, recognizing her intention too late. "Don't," he rasped. Miriam reached out and traced the handle of the whip nearest Aldrich's shoulder. It trembled slightly beneath her touch. "You used this on me," she whispered, "and on them. You carved our names in pain." Her voice was soft, fragile even, but it carried more power than any shout. Aldrich tried to look away, but Elias held his chin steady. "Look at her," he demanded. Aldrich's gaze snapped toward Miriam just as she lifted the whip and placed it gently across his lap, not as a weapon, but as an acknowledgement of every moment he had believed himself untouchable. Jonas tightened one more knot, making sure Aldrich couldn't shift. The master's breathing came rapid now, chest heaving as he realized the men and women he had ruled like tools now moved around him with purpose and unity he had never recognized. "Why?" he gasped, voice cracking under the pressure of both rope and truth. Elias answered for all of them. "Because a man who breaks others eventually breaks himself. You just never saw the cracks." Outside, the wind rustled through the grass, brushing against the barn door like a quiet witness. Inside, Aldrich Thorne, once the terror of Rosewater, sat bound by his own weapons, surrounded by those he believed too beaten to ever rise. Tonight, they had risen, and the night had only just begun. The barn felt colder now, as though the night itself had seeped through its wooden bones. Aldrich's breath came in short, sputtering bursts while the leather coils dug deeper into the soft flesh of his neck. He glared at the five standing around him, but the hatred in his eyes no longer carried power, only fear wearing the mask of anger. Elias stepped back, allowing Aldrich to feel the full weight of the ropes without support. The master gasped, his legs buckling, his shoulders straining to keep him upright. "Pathetic," Jonas murmured, not as an insult, but as a realization spoken aloud. He crouched beside Aldrich, eyes level with the man's panicked stare. "You ever wonder why we didn't run? Why we didn't fight sooner?" Aldrich choked, unable to answer, but Jonas continued anyway. "Because we knew what you were. Not a god, not a ruler, just a man with tools and cruelty." Miriam moved behind Aldrich, folding her arms as memories flickered across her mind. Her sister's screams, Elias carried half-conscious after a beating, the nights she'd pressed cloth against Tobias's wounds. "You didn't break us," she said softly. "You trained us. Every lash you gave made us sharper." Aldrich thrashed weakly at that, refusing to listen. Elias clicked his tongue. "Still trying to deny truth, even with your back against a post." Samuel tightened his grip on the rope, jaw clenched. "He ain't denied it. He just ain't accepted it yet." Aldrich's face flushed red as he clawed at the coils again, nails scraping helplessly. He had spent years controlling the very air others breathed. Now he fought for his own. Jonas rose slowly, his shadow stretching long against the flickering lantern light. "Do you remember the day you whipped Miriam's sister?" he asked quietly. Aldrich stiffened. He remembered. He always remembered his victories. "She tried to shield a child," Jonas continued, voice steady despite the fury beneath. "That child didn't even know what disobedience meant, but you taught her." Aldrich's face twisted. Shame, denial, anger, none fit neatly anymore. Miriam stepped forward, stopping just behind Jonas. "You said she needed to learn fear," she whispered, "but you taught us something different." Aldrich shut his eyes, trying to silence their voices with sheer will, but their words kept cutting deeper than any whip he'd ever swung. Elias knelt beside him now, his posture calm but coiled with long-held hurt. "You taught us what a man becomes when he trades decency for control," he said, "and you taught us what happens when people finally see the truth." Tobias leaned against one of the barn's support beams, arms crossed. His eyes held a quiet fire. "You think pain makes men obedient," he said, "but pain also makes them observant, patient, dangerous." Aldrich jerked his head away, refusing to meet their eyes. He had always lived in a world where consequences were only for the people beneath him. But now he was the one beneath 5 steady stares, 5 souls who had memorized every cruelty he'd committed. The horses shifted again, stamping nervously, as though the barn itself vibrated with what was coming. The night outside remained eerily still, waiting like something ancient holding its breath. They did not leave Aldrich alone in the barn. Not yet. The ropes held him upright against the post, his head bowed, breath ragged, but his mind still feverishly searching for a way out. The 5 knew better than to trust fear alone to keep him in place. Jonas stayed nearest, eyes never leaving the master's face, while Tobias and Samuel checked each knot again, fingers working with the certainty of men who had tied harnesses and grain sacks their whole lives. Miriam stepped back toward the door, cracked it just enough to peer outside. The plantation yard lay open and unnaturally quiet. No overseers crossing between sheds. No lanterns swinging in watchful hands. The big house glowed dimly on the hill, a few windows still lit, but the night around it looked hollow. Hollow in the way of something that didn't yet know it was about to break. "We can't keep him here till dawn," Tobias muttered. "Someone's bound to come looking." Elias nodded slowly. "We won't keep him here." Jonas frowned. "Then where?" Elias's gaze drifted to the distant silhouette of the great hanging tree beyond the main yard, older than any fence, any field, any house on Rosewater land. For years it had been a warning, stories whispered of men dragged beneath its branches and left swinging under the sunrise. Aldrich himself liked to threaten it when words failed him. "We take him there," Elias said softly. "Let the plantation wake up to the truth." Silence met his words. Heavy, electric, undeniable. They didn't decide it all at once. The choice settled over them like a slow, gathering storm. Miriam was the first to speak. "If we do that," she said, voice rough but steady, "there's no turning back. No pretending this was accident or chance." Jonas met her eyes. "We passed that line the moment we put rope to his throat." Samuel exhaled through his teeth, glancing toward the house. "What about the others? The children? The elders?" Tobias nodded. "If this goes wrong, they're the ones who'll pay first." Elias considered that, the weight of responsibility pressing down like a hand on his shoulders. "Then no one goes into this blind," he said. "We don't move him till the quarters know what's coming." Jonas loosened his rope just enough to keep Aldrich breathing but not comfortable. "He won't be going anywhere in the meantime," he muttered. Aldrich watched their exchange with growing dread. "You think you can rally them?" he croaked. "Half of them too scared to look me in the eye." Miriam leaned closer, her expression unreadable. "Fear don't last forever. Not when it's all a man's ever been given." She turned to Elias. "We wake Ruth, and Abram, and the others who remember how this land used to be." Elias nodded. "You three," he said, pointing to Jonas, Samuel, and Tobias, "stay here. Don't take eyes off him. If he so much as coughs wrong, tighten the lines. Miriam and I'll go to the quarters." Tobias smirked faintly. "Don't worry, we ain't letting the sun see him free." Aldrich swallowed, throat scraping against leather. For the first time, he felt truly small inside his own barn. The walk back to the quarters felt different now. Elias and Miriam moved through the night with the strange lightness of people who had already chosen their path. Their wounds still burned with every step, but the pain had shifted from something endured to something carried, like a shared banner. The cabins loomed in the dark, their shapes familiar as ribs of an old beast. Elias tapped gently on the first door, then the next. 3 soft knocks, a pause, 2 more. A signal old men had used long before him when whispering plans they couldn't risk speaking aloud. Inside, tired bodies stirred, shadows rising from straw pallets and rough-hewn bunks. Faces appeared in doorways. Ruth, her hair wrapped tight, eyes sharp despite the hour. Abram with his crooked shoulder, young Clara with a baby on her hip, old Isaac leaning on his cane. Fear flickered in their eyes when they saw the blood drying on Elias and Miriam's clothes, but curiosity burned brighter. "What's happened?" Ruth rasped. "He call you out again?" Miriam shook her head slowly. "No," she said. "We called him." The murmur that followed was like wind cresting over tall grass, soft, endless, rising. Elias stepped into the center of the narrow lane between cabins so everyone could see him. "We got him bound in the barn," he said simply. Gasps cut through the night. Clara clutched her child closer. Abram's brows shot up. Isaac's fingers tightened on his cane. "Bound?" he echoed. "You mean the master?" Elias nodded. "By his own whips." The words fell like a stone dropped into deep water. Waves of shock rippled outward, carrying fear, disbelief, and something else, something that had been buried too long, the first taste of possibility. Ruth stepped closer first, her bare feet whispering over the packed dirt. Her face, mapped with the lines of too many seasons under a merciless sun, studied Elias with a gaze that cut through panic and straight into truth. "You sure?" she asked quietly. "Sure he's tied? Sure this ain't some trick?" Elias met her eyes without wavering. "He's bound," he said. "Hands, throat, all of it. We used his own whips. He ain't going nowhere without us." A murmur rippled through the gathered crowd. Fear clung to their shoulders like a second skin, but beneath it something else began to stir. Anger with a spine, grief with teeth. Clara tightened her hold on her baby, tears burning in her eyes. "If they find out," she whispered, "they'll kill us all." Isaac tapped his cane once against the ground. "If they don't," he rasped, "they'll keep killing us one by one." The words settled heavy, but true. Abram rubbed his aching shoulder, gaze lifting toward the invisible barn in the distance. "You got a plan," he said to Elias. "I can hear it in your voice. Spit it out." Elias swallowed, feeling dozens of eyes anchoring him. "Before dawn," he said slowly, "we take him to the hanging tree. Tie him high where every soul on this land can see. Overseers, housefolk, field hands, all of them. Let no one say they didn't know what he was." Ruth nodded once, as though she'd been waiting her whole life to hear someone speak those words, but she wasn't done weighing the cost. "And what happens after?" she asked. "The men with rifles, the dogs, the cousins he writes letters to? You think they'll just bow to what we done?" Jonas had slipped in behind Elias, leaning quietly against a post as he listened. Now he stepped forward. "We already started tying threads," he said. "When Aldrich was sleeping off his drink last week, I checked the overseer's shed. Their rifles, firing pins loose as rotten teeth. Took 'em out tonight before we left." A few heads snapped toward him, eyes widening. Miriam added, "The dogs are chained and half-starved. They'll bark, but they won't chase far." Isaac gave a dry chuckle. "So you children been planning more than just tonight?" Tobias's voice carried from the back where he'd come to stand guard. "We didn't ask for this," he called, but he pushed till there was nowhere left to step. Elias turned slightly so he could see as many faces as possible. "We ain't dragging no one into this blind," he said. "If you stay in your cabins, you can say you didn't know. If you walk with us to that tree, you're saying you're done living under his shadow." The silence that followed throbbed with choice. Clara glanced at her sleeping baby and shook her head, not in refusal, but in resolve. "Where the little ones go?" she asked. Miriam answered without hesitation. "Root cellar behind cabin 3, door bars from the inside, they stay there till the shouting stops." Ruth placed a hand on Clara's shoulder. "I'll sit with them once my old bones see him hanging," she murmured. One by one voices rose, not in chaos but in quiet agreement. Abram nodded. "I'll help carry," he said. "These hands been building his barns long enough. Time they build something that ends him." Isaac tapped his cane again. "I may not walk fast," he grumbled, "but I'll walk far enough to see that tree." Young faces, once trained to look at the ground, lifted now with something like awakening in their eyes. Fear hadn't vanished, but it no longer ruled alone. Elias felt the weight of their trust settle over him like a mantle. He didn't want to lead. He'd never asked for it. But tonight, leadership was just another word for stepping forward when no one else could. "Then we move," he said. "Jonas, Tobias, Samuel, back to the barn. Make sure he's still breathing. We need him alive till the tree." Miriam squeezed Ruth's hand briefly before turning toward the root cellar. "Get the children," she said to Clara, "and anyone too old to run. Lock 'em in and don't open up till you hear my voice." The group began to scatter with purpose, no longer drifting like people waiting for orders, but moving like a body remembering its own strength. The night air grew thicker with anticipation as Elias led a small band back toward the barn. The glow from the big house shrank behind them. In the distance, the hanging tree stood etched against the dim horizon, its branches stretched wide like arms that had seen too much. For years it had been a symbol of their fear. Tonight it would become something else entirely, a witness to the moment the hunted turned and faced the hunter. The barn looked different when Elias, Jonas, Tobias and Samuel returned, darker, quieter, as if it understood what came next. The horses shifted nervously, their hooves scraping the floor as the lantern light flickered across their eyes. Aldrich hung in the ropes exactly where they'd left him, slumped but still conscious, his breath thin and wheezing. Sweat clung to his temples, and dried streaks of dirt and fear marred his once proud face. Jonas checked the knots automatically, tugging each one with steady hands. "Still breathing," he said, almost disappointed. Tobias smirked faintly. "He'll wish he wasn't once he sees where he's going." Aldrich stirred, lifting his head a fraction. You can't do this," he rasped. "You'll damn yourselves." Samuel stepped closer, leaning down until his shadow fell fully over Aldrich. "We were damned the moment we were born on your land." Elias watched Aldrich struggle with the ropes, watched him try to summon the authority that had ruled every inch of this place, but authority without obedience was nothing. "It's time," Elias said quietly. Together they loosened the ropes enough to drag him, but not enough to free him. Aldrich groaned, legs buckling uselessly under him as they hauled him toward the door. The barn door creaked open to reveal the waiting darkness outside, vast, silent, expectant. The air tasted different now, sharper, alive with a tension that pulled taut like the ropes around Aldrich's arms. Jonas shoved him forward. "Walk," he ordered. Aldrich stumbled, coughing, but fear forced his feet to move. For the first time, he walked without a whip in his hand. The yard outside the quarters glowed with a dim cluster of lanterns. Shadows of men and women, young, old, wounded, weary, gathered in silence. As Aldrich approached, heads lifted from doorways. Faces emerged from darkness. Eyes watched him, not with dread, not with helplessness, but with the kind of quiet judgment no court could match. Clara, standing near the root cellar door with her baby in her arms, didn't flinch when Aldrich's gaze met hers. Ruth leaned on Isaac's cane, her jaw set like stone. Abram cracked his knuckles, reminding Aldrich he had built half the plantation with those same hands. Aldrich stumbled, tripping on a root, and Tobias yanked him upright before he could fall. "Keep moving," Tobias muttered. Miriam stepped into view from behind Clara, her expression unreadable, lantern casting a warm ring of light around her bruised face. "There he is," she whispered. "The man who told us pain was a language." Jonas tightened his grip on Aldrich's arm. "Tonight," he said, "we answer back." They passed the last cabin, and the path opened toward the fields. The hanging tree loomed ahead, tall, ancient, a silhouette carved against the last shreds of moonlight. Its branches stretched wide, twisted and thick, shaped by storms and decades of whispered stories. Aldrich stopped cold when he saw it. His knees trembled. "No," he gasped. You don't understand what you're doing." "We understand perfectly," Elias replied. "For once we ain't the ones kneeling." Aldrich tried to step back, but Jonas and Samuel dragged him forward. The crowd followed slowly, their silence swelling behind the men like a tide rising in darkness. At the foot of the great tree, they forced Aldrich to stand, barely. His legs shook so badly that the rope nearly slipped from Samuel's grip. The lanterns surrounding them cast shifting shadows across the gnarled trunk, the ground beneath it worn smooth by years of fear. Elias stepped forward, looking up at the wide, heavy limb that stretched above them. "How many times," he asked quietly, "did you threaten to hang someone from this tree?" Aldrich swallowed, throat scraping painfully. "It was the law," he whispered. "My right." Jonas stepped beside Elias, voice cold as winter. "And tonight it's ours." Tobias climbed onto the lower branch, securing the rope with practiced movements. Samuel steadied Aldrich, while Jonas wrapped the remaining coils around the master's chest and arms. Aldrich shuddered, eyes wild. "Please," he rasped. Don't do this." Miriam approached him slowly, every step a reclaiming of something stolen. "You begged no one," she whispered. "Not when you whipped fathers till they couldn't walk. Not when you tore families apart. Not when you made children scream." Aldrich closed his eyes, breath trembling. "I was given this land," he muttered. Elias leaned close, voice low. "And we're taking it back, piece by piece." Tobias dropped the final loop over the branch. The rope tightened around Aldrich's torso, and he let out a strangled cry as his toes lifted slightly off the ground. But Elias raised a hand, halting them. "Not yet," he said. The crowd watched. The wind stilled. Even the night held its breath. Elias looked into Aldrich's terrified eyes, seeing at last the man behind the legend, the coward behind the cruelty. "This ain't just for us," he said softly. "It's for every soul you broke who can't stand here tonight." Jonas gripped the rope. Tobias braced his feet. Samuel inhaled deeply. Miriam stepped back, tears hot but unbroken. Elias gave a final nod. "Pull." And as the rope rose, the world shifted. The tree that had witnessed generations of suffering now bore witness to a different kind of history. A reckoning carved not by violence alone, but by unity, forged in pain. Under the pale glow of lanterns and the rising breath of dawn, the master who had believed himself eternal swung at last from the branches he once claimed as his right. And the five who had carried his scars now carried something far heavier, far stronger, freedom built from the roots of defiance.